So there are 4 exercises, and I figure we can probably do one decently, one haphazardly, and then wrap up. So your choices here. What do you want to focus on? This first one, by the way, I think is probably a given, if you don't mind. I think it's good because it pulls together a number of ideas, and it's really about creating a plan. And good for the badge, because it is related to the badge as well. But then, other than that, choices. So if you look at page 5, page 6, page 7 in here, they're really some of the exercises. So we can either do a quick quality assurance one, which means you're going to have to write a test question. We could do mitigating rate or bias. That's the one with all the really lovely icons that I thought would be really nice to see. I could show you them if we don't do it anyway. And the last one, item 4, which I would is an option. Learning reform would pick up on some of the themes you heard at lunch. It really takes us a bit outside of assessment per se, but talks about what's happening and where the future of assessment will go. So basically, I'm suggesting we do this first exercise, if you don't mind. But then in terms of option 2, a show of hands, would you rather have 2, 3, or 4? Put your fingers up, 2, 3, or 4, okay? So I want to see the number of 2s, 3s, and 4s. Okay. This is not going to work because it's about equal division. Okay, you know what? I've made an executive decision. I'm going to do 3 because if we run short of time, I can abbreviate that. So, sorry folks, I wish there was more time. We're going to start with 1, and then I'm going to make sure we at least get in the second, and then we'll do some wrap-up comments. I'm sorry I can't do more with you, but I want to assure you that the PowerPoint deck, which also has notes in the notes fields, will be available to you. If you are interested in a copy of it, my email address is on the back of this booklet. You have to send me a note, and if you don't do that, it won't happen, I can assure you. So, because my memory is not good enough and cards won't make it happen. So let's move on to creating an assessment strategy. Now at the break, one thing that I was reminded of, and I want to add right up front in this because I think it'll play out in this particular exercise. You know, very frequently I've used the word test, and sometimes I've used the word assessment, and I know because of the varied level of work in here and application that sometimes people think of this more narrowly, as in, i.e., the test you're designing, and others will think of it more broadly, as in the assessment strategy or process you're following. And some might think of it very, specifically to an RPL context over others. Look, I want to reassure you and remind you that all of these principles and ideas I'm talking about apply in all of those circumstances. You have to think about how it applies in your circumstance, but really these principles do cascade across them. I find I'm using different language every now and then because I'm just trying to illustrate some of the links. But if it's unclear, let me know. But think broadly because these ideas do apply in all circumstances. Okay? So with that in mind, it's actually a good starting point on this assessment strategy point. This is something I will do a quick intro to and explain a little bit about. As I'm walking through this, we're going to walk through about 9 items. You might want to be jotting some notes down on page 4. But then once I've done that, then you're going to do some work at your table. Now, because of time, I didn't scramble the tables. I promised you that this morning, so you're stuck with the same people for the afternoon. But otherwise, we'll lose another 5 minutes. But you're going to be working, once we go through these 9 items and you've got your notes, then you're going to have some discussion at your table, and we're going to come back with some wrap-up on it. Okay, so what are we doing here? Well, look, this also goes by a lot of different names, but what I wanted to do is pull a number of the concepts together that we looked at earlier, and some new things, because we only have so much time to cover all of that. But what we're going to do is walk through a basic methodology on how you make decisions on what type of assessment you're going to deliver on, what format it's going to be in, etc. So I'm going to use the template that's here, walk you through some examples. You'll have to translate that a little bit to your own context, and you may wish to define things in a slightly different framework. Again, for consistency, I tend to default back to this manual in terms of the language used in this. So Bear with me if it's a little different than you're familiar with. But what is an assessment strategy? Really, it's a process. If it won't advance for me. Sorry, try again. It's always good if there's a slide, but it's not essential. So really the idea here of an assessment strategy is to have specifications on what you want to do for your assessment, okay? Now again, you can think about this very narrowly as you're designing an assessment tool, let's say a multiple choice exam, and you follow through on this process. Or you might think about it more broadly as an assessment strategy, which might be more than a singular tool. This process will apply in both cases. So we're going to talk about what are these specification documents, and then we're going to get into a bit about the overview on it. So a typical assessment strategy or plan or blueprint or specifications product is going to include all of your basic information. Basically, you want to answer all of the classic questions we started off the morning with. The who, what, where, when, and how, the why. And in this way, you actually are going to make sure that you structure your strategy around those plans. So in a classic setting, what a contractor would typically do is articulate all this and then rationalize the recommendations in terms of what that strategy looks like and design the respective tools for it. So the introduction and purpose statement is actually fairly straightforward. You should really just build a rationale on why you're doing assessment, what type of assessment for what purpose. Now, it may have multiple purposes, but be very clear about why you're doing it. And that's important because everything else that follows should support your rationale. There's no one formula for this. You can rationalize this and describe what you're doing in any way that suits the environment you're working in. It sometimes is in a single word or sentence, and for some people they need pages to articulate what they need to do. It really is who's going to be the user of your specifications document to be able to defend what you're working on. Prerequisites are required conditions are also something you're going to articulate. You know, who qualifies for your assessment, basically? Who would be eligible to get assessed? Because that's one very important aspect about assessment is you don't want to just make it available, have people coming to it that are not fit for it because that does not serve anyone well. Articulate who it's for, but then if there are conditions around prerequisites or requirements or conditions that should be met in order to make it fair, then that should be articulated as well. Then, and so prerequisites can take on any number of forms. And like in a credentialing system, like a credential like for a profession, they're probably going to identify things like a point system linked to education. They might identify experiential requirements. They could identify things like minimum language requirements if you can only supply it in a particular language format. I mean, any conditions you attach to it that are legitimate are fair game. And they should be articulated so that someone who's coming in knows that they're qualified to write that assessment or to take part in that effort. Otherwise, you create a disadvantage right up front. Okay? Explicit, specific, and of course, it should be commensurate with your objectives. Now, the assessment process is one that takes a fair amount of thinking and planning. So this is where you are going to recommend the form of assessment that you would use. And I'm using the example here, but if you are going to provide a multiple choice exam, well, what size will it be? Now, if you think back earlier when we had that example of that competency thing and we had all that criteria, if we would have mapped all that out, and I'll show you an example of this, you get to a point where you realize, oh, we do need a certain amount of weighting in this category because there's a lot more in it, and we need less weighting in that category because there's less in it. And if we do about this number of questions, we'll have covered the whole scope. I'll show you that. And that gives you an idea of what size it should be. This principle applies to any content you have. You make decisions about the weighting of it. You might have other conditions around it, how long it would take, what are the administrative conditions it needs to be in, like is it proctored, is it not proctored, does it have to be with 2 proctors or 2 assessors? Whatever the conditions are that are how it should be managed is important. If it's strictly limited to, say, online or paper-based or on Saturdays, whatever those constraints are or specifications are, you would identify them. You want to define the scoring procedures. This is fairly technical, but you do want to say how it's scored. Is it scored electronically? Is it scored by hand? How is the decision made on a pass score? All that kind of thing. The order of operation might be important too. If there's a battery of assessments attached to your process, is there an order that things have to get done? Do you need to do A before you can do B? Sometimes that matters greatly. Or complete one, before we'll give you a feedback on it before you can do two. Because if it's going to impede on their progress, because if they failed one, it's going to ergo affect what happens in two, then it should be specified in an order of operation. So this is the kind of message you might have. I mean, again, this is linked to certification because it was easy for me to pull from our files, but they are certified in this. They must demonstrate evidence and prerequisites. They're going to write a challenge exam. It's multiple choice. Once they write the exam, then they're going to have to do the performance evaluation. And then the assessment process must be done within 6 months. So whatever the prescription is that ensures your maintenance of your validity and reliability of what you're doing. You also want to prescribe things around the tools themselves. If the process is going to require the use of exams, for example, we notice that to run the system, you need a minimum of 2 exams, one for rewrite, because it says the person rewriting has to change the form of exam they're going to use, and so on. Now, these are examples. There's a lot more that you should have in there. I'm just illustrating conceptually the kinds of things you might include in your prescription. Structural variables are things around, well, you see them on there. What format are you going to put it in? How long is it going to be? How much weighting are you putting to the cognitive domains? And so if we go back to it, this is a kind of simple way to summarize some of those. Here we're going to have, it's a multiple choice exam. The item types are going to be multiple choice with 4 options. They're going to be case-based questions for about 10% of those exam questions in the bank. 90% of them will be independent questions. The length of the exam is going to be 150 items based on a minimum bank of 400. You see how prescribed that is? Now, I'm using this exam thing because it's easy to speak to in a very short period of time, but you can transfer the same thing to anything you do in the RPL environment. If you're looking at content, what format is it going to be presented in? How much are they going to go after? How are you going to weight it? How much time are you going to give people to write it? It might be infinite, or it might be 2 hours. It might be 10 minutes. Build a rationale. Is it proctored? Is it self-administered? Is it open book? What is it? What mechanism? Might be more than one mechanism. So these are the kinds of things that you prescribe, and it's basically the recipe for the design of your assessment strategy, and it becomes your standard on that process. So as your product evolves and changes, and there's changes in the standard of practice itself, you still go back to your recipe as you generate new assessment tools to support your objectives. Content weighting becomes really an explicit summary of where you put more weight over one thing over the other. As we know, some things are more important than others, and we want to make sure that we weight it appropriately. So, like that earlier example we had from your blue sheets, this would be like a summary of the top-level statements of what's in a standard. And then we know the taxonomy, and we know how many questions we'd probably have to test in that area to cover it. And so we get an idea by just sort of doing this process that, we're probably going to have about 15 test items in category A minimally, or we wouldn't cover the scope there. And we probably need about 20 in category B, and we probably need about 15 in category C. And if we look at the 8 categories, it adds up to about 130 items. So maybe we need an exam that's probably 130, maybe 140 items, but it's not 200, right? And then it's weighted based on where the emphasis lies. So you're seeing a snapshot of that, of which A would only rank about 6 to 10% of your exam, because if you look at the rest of the content that has to be addressed, it only ranks that well. To extrapolate on the idea you saw earlier, this is a better version of that. It really takes some more information for you to work with. So if you look at this, you can see if I look at any competency, which has a lot of detail in the standards document, there's all this rating that was given to it. So it's not a high level of criticality, but it is done every day. It's sort of medium difficulty. It would take someone 2 years to be able to master it if they were new at it. Its taxonomy is relatively low, but clearly there's enough content in there that we think really to cover it, typically you'd need at least one question, maybe two. But all of this information and the content that's in there gave us a clue that you need at least that to measure it, and some things less. In this category, you'll notice this one was grouped because these had a lot of very similar concepts. They were interrelated. They had similar dimensions about them. And basically, if we had 2 to 3 questions within those, we know we sufficiently covered it. Now, I'm going through this quickly, but basically that's the role that an analyst will do in making decisions about how much weight you attach to each of these categories. And the sum total of this tells me, if I add this up, there's 10 to 12 questions that are likely necessary for me to sufficiently test category A. You can do more, but you don't want to do double the number. It's not necessary, right? And there is a logic behind it. There's a little more nuance than that behind this, because you can also look at things like all of the taxonomy things. And if you see a lot of, this is like Deb's point earlier, if you see many of the same taxonomy, basically measuring the same thing, but it's characterized as a different skill, but it's essentially the same, you might also be able to negotiate a fewer of those things. If it's all problem solving at the same level in a similar context, it doesn't much matter if it's called monitor or maintain or oversee, right? You're still doing relatively the same kind of skill, as it were, in a similar context with a similar complexity. So all this is really illustrating is it takes work. It takes work to analyze, think critically about it, use the guidance of some indicators like this, so as you map it out, you can begin to rationalize how much weight you attach to it. This is true of any content. It doesn't matter, whether it's drawing from a battery of products, like a whole bunch of textbooks you're trying to figure out how you test against, or an occupational standard, or whatever it is you might be working with. So there is work involved. It does take a kind of analytical mind to look at it. You do have to have an understanding of the content well, and almost invariably do include subject matter experts to help you validate this. As an analyst, you get a good idea, but your subject matter experts will sniff out things that look really peculiar. Because you're building on the knowledge base that you have, but there's other mitigating factors that might come into play. Yes, Jennifer.
You use a similar template if you're not testing per se, but if you're doing a skills demonstration or you're assessing.
Exactly. This not only helps with assessment, but it does also, in a way, give you a prescription for things like the rest of the curriculum that you might design. Like if you're designing training, or if you're designing a diagnostic tool, or even an information piece. If you want to begin to describe this domain, you can start to say things like, there are 7 major categories of content related to this domain, of which about 10% of what is related to the testing is going to be in here. And it might also give you an idea of how much time you spend on the training around some of this stuff. So you can read the data in a few ways. I'm illustrating it from the assessment lens, but the same information informs some of those other practices. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay, let me continue. I have to stand behind this desk to move this. Sorry, Deb?
Just to follow up maybe on Jennifer's question. So this all pertains to developing a test, but if we were having someone complete a case study or complete a portfolio or do a skill demonstration, then we could actually use this assessment strategy to flesh out all of that.
That's
so
right.
I guess what I want to make sure is that this is really a useful tool for any kind of assessment strategy that you're designing for a learner who wants recognition of progress.
Absolutely. So, let's just use this example for a second on a portfolio. A portfolio is going to have a range of criteria, and not everything's the same in there, right? Some things you want more evidence of, more information around, some of it more qualitative, some more quantitative. So that's the same logic, right? You're going to have your content articulated, and you're going to use indicators. These are some examples. You may have other criteria you use to indicate, and then you're going to weight it. But it's important that you weight it as the key message in the end, right? It's not all equal.
So the good thing about that is if you know things are critical, and your learner knows things are critical, and you're giving them information about what to include in an evidence collection or a portfolio that's critical,
Yeah.
then you've done a really good job versus just put a portfolio to get about these competencies. You're saying we need to see evidence of this. So I think that's excellent.
And just to build on that a little further, if it's critical, it's probable that that evidence has to be of a particular standard, right? I mean, you're really concerned that that evidence is something you can trust. You know, it has all of the trappings around it that you can be doubly assured that they know how to do that or whatever. Where if it's not so critical, they might supply softer evidence that you might think is acceptable. You know, I don't want to water this down, but criticality becomes a very big part of your narrative so that it's trustworthy, right? And stuff like frequency, if it's done every single day and they do a lot of it, you better be sure that that person you're credentialing or giving evidence or something can do that, because that would be really troubling if they end up showing up in their, I don't know, work example, and it's such a common task, but they have no idea how to do it or no evidence of it. You know, so all these things play out. You got to just make decisions about what's important, right? Does that make sense? Feels like a heavy topic right after lunch. This magic wand is not working anymore. Okay. So the next item that we talked about earlier is Bloom's taxonomy. It's another kind of element that's important, because when you do assessment, one of the things that the APA often looks for is, are you assessing at the right level? So it's not just on weighting of things, but are you testing at the right level? So again, every competency that you want to include in your assessment strategy will have an articulated taxonomy to it, right? A level to it. Is it basic recall, or is it analysis? Is it synthesis? What's the aim of that competency that you're trying to measure? So when you articulate what all that is, and it's in your strategy, you're going to know you need evidence that they can synthesize and analyze, not just be able to recall or be familiar with something. So you do need to assign some form of taxonomy. The adapted Bloom's framework is fairly often used because it's familiar, it's easy, it has some, but in the end it doesn't matter which taxonomy you have as long as you articulate what the different levels mean in some form of complexity. Because in the end you're going to design your assessment strategy to measure at those levels. So you're going to have to show evidence. If it's just recall, you know, you can write a basic kind of test question that's seeing if they can recall it. You could even do something like a crossword puzzle, because they could recall that information to fill out a box, and that would work. But if it's analysis, well, that's not going to work. It's a very different scenario, right? Same with the evidence you're looking for in a portfolio. So if you need to see analysis, then you better see a product that they're producing that shows analysis. And you may have to do more with it than that.
You can see if the other one works.
Try one. This one works. Okay. Situational and context variables. Look, this is also helpful in reminding you about what your strategy should look like. In the end, I mean, again, I'm using a job context here, but who is the user of this exam? Who is the client, the candidate? So what's the context they're operating in? You don't want to design in a strategy that is very disconnected to their work context. You know, for example, an obvious one, if you're in the nursing field, you're not going to design a strategy where they're going to be doing something that is not nursing-like, right? So in the nursing field, they'll have strategies that they call OSCEs, which are really, you know, simulating the kinds of activities they do in real life. That's good because that emulates or links to what they practice. So that's a logical thing to do, is have them perform in a simulated context. But would you subject them to doing a form of assessment that is not at all the way they practice? No, it wouldn't make sense. So you have to design your strategy to fit the job context, to fit the demands of the competencies in hand. And there might be all kinds of related job contexts to think about. Like in some contexts, they might have to be able to perform something, and they may have to do it in a very short window of time. Time will matter. So not only do they have to be, you know, skilled at it, they have to do it within 30 seconds. Because if they don't, it's a fatal issue. So again, your strategy would have to accommodate that logic of this particular element is going to be something we know they can do in 30 seconds. So this is why you articulate the whole context in which it's applied. And it often is usually a description of the type of candidate that's in play, the type of work environment they're in, the kinds of conditions they face in that work environment. If you think back to that competency example we had, that standard that's on the blue paper, all those things we called variables tell us all about this. Then we got a very clear image about what those range of contexts look like. Bottom line, you got to design your tool to fit those range of contexts. So, this would be an example. They work in this, they do that, and it doesn't have to be complicated at times, but in the end, it's your measure against your a strategy. Does it fit all of those? If it does, great. If it doesn't, you're still working on it. The standard setting and scoring. This is basically how you determine the pass mark. It's not arbitrary, right? It's based on decisions of all types. There are many different ways to go about this. There are some classical methodologies. One of the more common ones used is an Angoff or modified Angoff, but there's Ebel, there's many, many of them. It depends, again, on your context and what works for you. And it depends a bit on the stakes of your exam. For some of them, you can be a little more arbitrary with this, but really as you move up that continuum of formative up into summative, you need to have a very declarative way in which you're setting that pass mark. So things like a modified Angoff are very, very commonly used in the testing world. And that's, again, where you get a lot of job incumbents who are subject matter experts who look at every one of your test questions or your criteria, and then make decisions about weighting it, and that's a whole other process for another day. But that sum total translates into what your pass mark looks like. So it's not because you think, 75 sounds good, or maybe 50 because we don't want to make it too hard for them, or, let's make it 90 because we only want 10% to pass, and we think if we make it high enough. It's not about that. It's got to be rationalized against the complexity of what you're measuring under all these conditions we talked about. So these methodologies that are out there are very commonly used. They've been well tested. They're well proven. There's probably 5 or 6 that are fairly common, but bar none in North America, this Angoff method is the most likely version to use. Actually, more accurately, a modified Angoff. So here's an example of that. It's representative group of subject matter experts reviewed each item. They ranked it, blah, blah, blah. That's what the document would explain, how you went about setting that. This is the point of defensibility. Remember I told you that example of going into court in Alberta? This is what I had to tell them about. Oh, this is how we set the pass mark. And that's what they wanted to see. Because then I could say it was defensible. Yes, the pass mark was X. Now, why do you do this, right? If you generate these forms of your assessment, and particularly if you have more than one form, whether it's more than one multiple choice exam or more than one kind of instrument measuring RPL, they need to be equated in the end. I mean, one could be more difficult than the next, but the pass mark, therefore, would adjust, right? I mean, look, if you generate a multiple choice exam and all the hard questions show up, well, then the pass mark is going to be a little bit lower. But if you generate one and they get all the easy questions, well, then they're going to have to work a little bit harder to pass, as it were, right? Well, they work the same, but it equates it. It's the same in RPL. If you have more than one kind of instrument, there needs to be an equating mechanism, and this is a bit of how you can create a defensibility on it. So you articulate what that looks like, and then you may also have some identified renewal requirements. This is usually after all of that other stuff, but ongoing, what does it look like? But how do you maintain it? It's really 2 things here. How do you know that you're maintaining your system? So what do you do around that? And how do you act on it? And there's different circumstances for it. So it shouldn't sit dormant and go, every 10 years we're going to act on this because it's the flavor of today and we've got some resources and it's all of a sudden become a concern. No, it should be ongoing. So when you're looking at assessment strategies, you should have policies in place that deal with basic errata. Fix it as it goes. Doesn't have to wait. It doesn't impact the overall approach to what you're doing, but you're maintaining it. Then there might be changes in the standard, which will then trigger a whole change in your assessment strategy. So these are kind of trigger points that determine when you make changes, the frequency of them. You need a policy around that. You need to articulate in your guidelines that we're just doing here when you act on this and why. In the end, it's a recipe, right? It's a prescription. It really tells anyone who's not the subject matter expert, who's not a testing expert, how it is you came to construct your strategy and what recipe you follow. So when you're not around and your administrator doesn't know what it's all about, etc., a testing person can come in and recreate that environment or maintain it for you. Okay? So specificity matters in here. Get it right, get it detailed. And it's not always easy, so do the best you can to start. Okay, so what you've done is get a quick overview of that. You get 5 minutes as a group to discuss and put a few thoughts down. And then we're going to debrief, and then I have only 5 minutes left with you. So I'm going to be very rapid with one of the other points. Is that okay? So I just like to hear very briefly from people. Does this framework that we just went through, does it resonate with you? Is it something you might find useful? What would you adjust from it? Anyone? Don? A lot of moving parts. Yep. That sounds like assessment, doesn't it? Look, I'm sorry there was such an abbreviated point, but you get the idea that a plan matters, right? And getting that detailed matters. And so if you're not operating with some logic around your strategy, it really does behoove you to take some time to work through that carefully. And that framework gives you at least the kind of cheat points to think about. Even if you don't get it all right, it's at least some kind of a logic to start thinking about it. And as you work with these, you'll discover that you'll adapt it to your needs. It's not that complicated, but at least it helps you rationalize what you're doing, particularly when you're trying to educate others on what you're doing. This is your framework. This is how we do this with some sense of logic. And the good news is it is backed up by a lot of good literature to support doing that in that way. Okay? So with that in mind, if you don't mind, I'm going to ramrod you through another thing. I'm going to be very quick because we've literally got 5 minutes, and then I wanted to wrap up with 1 or 2 comments. I'm sorry that it was too abbreviated this afternoon, but we'll do our best. Look, the second item, which we did not talk about, is a whole battery of criteria on how to evaluate if you've got good assessment tools. And I have a whole range of criteria for that. I've chosen not to talk to you about it because it's a bit lengthy for the time we have, but also the slide deck will have all the list for you, so you're going to have all the criteria. Anyway, you can go home and look at the criteria and figure it out for yourself, okay? We're not going to do it as a group. But I do want to cover off this one quickly, if you don't mind, because the images are really fun, and so it makes it worthwhile for the 5 minutes. Now, when we think about assessment, so much of it, as we've mentioned more than once, is really dependent on the qualifications of your administration team. It's more than just the tool that you're operating with. And core to some of that is your assessor themselves. So let's just pick up on the assessor point for a moment. Often what we see and what people are concerned about is the bias that creeps in. So we're going to walk through some of the common examples of bias, and then we're going to, well, if we would have had time, we could have been able to discuss it. But since we don't, that's what you can do at your break today, is talk about assessor bias. And that way it won't be entirely lost. I know you needed something to talk about at break, right? And then, of course, we could have talked about how to overcome it, but you're going to be on your own now for that one. So anyway, let's go through the list. By the way, bias can be talked about in many different ways. Some of this is actually institutional bias rather than assessor per se. But let's walk through it, and this will be familiar. I'm sure many of you will realize this. But as we're walking through this, I suggest reflect a little bit on your own practice and ask yourself, how well do we do with that, okay? So one of the key issues that you see, of course, is what's referred to as halo effect or halo error. And that's, of course, where the assessor or the administrator tends to basically disregard difficult factors, and they see things as all very positive. They might have just really connected well with the personality of the person, and so everything is rosy. This idea? And of course, the flip side of this is referred to as the horn effect, where, I guess that speaks for itself. When the rater sees all bad because of one factor that was poorly rated, or because the personality of the person they didn't like, or they didn't like their hair color or something, reminded them of their estranged mother-in-law. So everything then becomes a problem. I know. It's true. It's a fact, but okay. Central tendency is the other phenomena. Look, when a rater gives everybody average ratings or starts to rate everything average in general with a particular candidate, this happens when they're lazy, when they don't know the content, when they just feel like they're not sure how to rate it, so they'll just put it somewhere in the middle because, safe bet. But it begs a lot of questions. Probably the tool itself might be problematic. The assessor is lazy, or the the criterion is not explicit enough. So pay attention to that for sure. And by the way, every one of these, every assessor or person you have in your team, you're going to be monitoring all of this across their performance in general, right? How do they look relative to others when they rate things, and are there some symptoms showing up on these sorts of matters? Because they might always, if you start comparing one assessor's results to another, and you see a lot of central tendency with one as a habit, you know there's an issue happening there when you don't see it with others, right? But if everyone is doing central tendency on the same dimension, you might have a problem with your tool. So you want to go look at that, because maybe the criteria is not explicit. Or if everyone on the first one is always rated very high, you might not be measuring much at all, and that's why it's so easy for people to measure it easily, right? Okay, the third category, aren't these great images, by the way? Really, aren't they nice? Okay, the third category is what's called leniency bias, and that's where there's inflated ratings, and that's usually because they're sympathetic towards the candidate for some reason. So you just feel sorry for them, you think they deserve it, get a bit of a break once in a while. And then the reverse is the strictness bias, where they're overly critical, severe. Then there is cross-cultural biases, and often that's just a lack of appreciation for the differences in cultural behaviors and attitudes, and it could be read as bad performance or poor performance. So again, be very mindful of this, because people might just not understand they have that bias as well. So you're monitoring to see if they're just missing a cue or picking up on something that's inappropriate. They're basically measuring the wrong thing, right? Then there's, of course, personal prejudice, false attributing biases. That's making assumptions about a candidate because of a particular trait that they have, and it picks up on their past experiences. So they may have had a candidate, a year ago, and it reminds them a lot of the candidate they're assessing, and whatever the thoughts were of that other candidate, they apply here because, it's easy to do so. So it's a problem, and that often comes up, or they might just have some prejudice, in which case you should fire them anyway. So then there's this idea of recency error, and that are sometimes called the effect. And this is also related to the idea of something called contrast bias. It just goes by different names. And that's comparisons made with people of similar circumstances. So it's a little bit like I just described, but often you have a group of people going through, and what will occur is that if the majority of the group is performing in a certain way, and that was very recent measures, there's sometimes assumptions made that everyone else in the group is going to perform the same way, or it's this kind of very recent memory of experience that's similar that attributes to how they're rating things because it just looks familiar and they make assumptions about it. Another kind of bias that shows up is just when the assessor or administrator has mood, fatigue, or stress, or is influenced by a negative event in their life. They may have a personal issue of some form, and it basically impairs their judgment. So their bad mood translates into a bad score, basically. So, it's a little tip about assessment. You should always only have people doing this when they're in the right frame of mind and not on drugs. And sometimes drugs helps, but you got to know the difference. That's the problem. And then there's this idea of self-rater bias. This is where the candidate very often misjudges their own stuff. Self-rater bias. So that's, when it's often the case primarily in the, self-assessments when someone has a hard time gauging their own. They either inflate or most often deflate their competencies or their experience. And so that shows up, right? Then other factors that contribute to really bad ratings, if you want, are things like time delay and faulty and waning memory. As we all know, if you don't do these ratings or scoring or reviews in a timely way, memories fade and your impressions fade and fatigue sets in. It's a real challenge in portfolio work when you've got a large body of work and it's going to take you some time to review. It's tricky because your memory fades and it's hard to keep it all together. So one of the tips around assessment is that you do try to manage the scheduling of these activities within a short window of time. Plus, you want to give the candidate results within a short window of time. So all of this should be scheduled so that you can react, respond, review within a short window, and that keeps it fresh and will hopefully mitigate any of those kinds of concerns. Another area is around structural bias, and this is usually a systemic issue, and it's usually institutional based, where it's kind of blinders on it in a way. That is to say, you follow a process because that's the process that's prescribed and you do it, and you don't realize that there's actually bias crept in. It's just your way of operating, and you don't notice it. You could have all kinds of things that contribute to that. And so that's just a blinder in a way, but it does create a bias. You could start to see some patterns that emerge, and it has all to do with just the way you're managing it rather than anything else. And if you're taught to follow a very specific protocol, and that's what you do, but then you're not looking outside of it, you could end up with some issues like that. And then there's the calibration bias, and that's just when the way the instrument is designed, the way it's calibrated, how you add it up, how you score from it, might actually be faulty in some form or another. And that bias can creep into your systems for long term. And then, of course, the results are not telling. They don't bear real. So anyway, those are 12 quick examples and 12 really nice images to work with. And that'll give you at least a bit to think about when you're looking at your own systems. Now, we are out of time, folks. I just wanted to let you know that there are a few other things in the deck that you can work with, and I encourage you to explore if you want the deck. And they do cover off things that were in your manual, in your little booklet that we didn't cover. So there's more criteria in there for you to work with on quality processes. There's some guidelines on working with candidates. And there's some recommendations on some other fronts that hopefully brought it together today. I'm sorry we did run out of time. My name is on the back of that package, so you can follow up with me if you like. And I know there's some ending comments here for some additional notes. So thank you.
I want to thank Phil for a dynamite presentation. I know we're probably all feeling somewhat overwhelmed and drowning in such valuable information that we want to grasp every bit of it. And thank you for that, Phil, for filling us up. And just to let you know that the slide deck will be available. Watch for the reminder to submit a conference evaluation. It'll come out next week, possibly as early as Wednesday. And when you follow that email, there will be a link to a Dropbox with Phil's entire PowerPoint presentation on it. So you don't actually have to email Phil to send it to you. Well, thank you, Phil. This is a small token of our appreciation, yes. And Clarence as well, thank you for your assistance. So we'll take a short break and then we'll reconvene. I believe the time will be at 2, help me out with this, 2:45? 2:15? Yeah, it was out of 30 minutes, eh? So 2:15, please go to your whatever session you're attending. 10 more minutes, 10 minutes. Thank you, John.